In 2017 in New York, a man dressed in black rushed into a restaurant. The strange thing was that he not only didn't order food, but instead used a fierce glare to shoo away the waitress. After adjusting his sunglasses, pointing straight at the restaurant door, the man listened to everything around him, observing every smallest movement in the restaurant. Finally, he heard a familiar cough from the kitchen. That sound was like a signal. The man immediately stood up, charged straight into the kitchen, using a broom to block the door. His target was precisely the chef. The man ignored the chef's warning, grabbed a frying pan, and lunged into a fight with him. Although the chef resisted fiercely, he was ultimately no match for the man. Before long, he was knocked down and choked. Who was this man, after all? What kind of grudge did he and the chef have? To clarify these matters, we need to turn back time to 1 year prior. According to statistics, women speak about 20,000 words a day, while men speak 17,000 words. But this clearly didn't apply to Frank, because every day he spoke at least 80,000 words. Frank was a top lawyer, a skilled and sharp orator. He saw words as weapons and the law as a game. He once used his extraordinary professional abilities to successfully help a murderer be declared innocent. However, according to Frank, among those 80,000 words, only 3 were truly important: saying "I love you" to the one you love. Although Frank appeared artificial and cold in society, deep down he loved his family immensely. He had promised to watch his daughter's performance that evening, but as he was waiting for the elevator, his boss suddenly called him back for an urgent matter. What was worse was that after resolving the case, Frank got stuck in traffic on the way. At this moment, his daughter was already on stage. When she saw the empty seat below, the smile on her face was immediately replaced by disappointment. Today, his daughter sang Frank's favorite song, but Frank still hadn't appeared. His wife had to force a smile, took out her phone, and recorded everything. The melodious singing echoed throughout the hall, mixed with disappointment. When Frank arrived at the auditorium, the performance had long ended. He took out his phone to call his wife, but was immediately hung up on. Frank, filled with bitterness, had to go home. He filled his daughter's room with stuffed animals to express his apology. At this moment, he received a message from his wife with a video of his daughter's performance. Watching his daughter confidently under the lights, Frank couldn't help but smile with pride and satisfaction. But when he called his wife back, no one answered. It was already past 10 p.m. The noisy rain made Frank's heart gradually restless. However, as time passed, he not only didn't wait for his wife and child to come home, but instead waited for the police. The police took Frank to an abandoned train station. The feeling of unease grew stronger. Frank ran frantically under the pouring rain. He saw his wife and child's bodies discarded like trash in a storm drain. This scene struck him like a bolt of lightning. The torrential rain continued, but even the roaring thunder couldn't drown out Frank's heartbreaking cries. He couldn't believe that just because he broke a promise once, he and his family were now separated by life and death. Not long after his wife and daughter's funeral was held, Frank, as if drained of his soul, stood dazed in place like a soulless corpse. After everyone left, his father-in-law came to Frank, but he offered no words of comfort, instead expressing the long-suppressed dissatisfaction in his heart. In his father-in-law's opinion, even if the culprit was found, there would be smooth-talking lawyers like Frank to defend him and get him off. His father-in-law had always looked down on Frank, believing he had deceived his daughter. He didn't give Frank a chance to explain and coldly severed ties with him. At this point, Frank had completely lost all his loved ones. He looked at everything in his daughter's room, drunkenly humming the songs she used to sing. The sweet memories of the past were vivid, now turning into sharp swords piercing deep into Frank's tormented heart. And what enraged him most was the attitude of the detectives. The heavy rain had long destroyed the crime scene. The police only found a few small golden threads. Frank thought it was an important clue, but the detective told him that these were just common threads, completely unnecessary to investigate. Moreover, the crime scene was in a chaotic area controlled by gangs. Even if there were witnesses, no one would dare to testify. Seeing the detective's irresponsible attitude, Frank's rage immediately erupted. He stood up right away to end this meaningless conversation. Just as Frank was about to leave, police officer Hank suddenly called him back. He promised Frank that he would not give up the investigation and would definitely find the truth. But Frank had heard these words too many times. He no longer had any hope. In despair, Frank walked into a bar, but the more he drank one glass after another, the pain in his heart not only didn't disappear, but grew even more intense. At this moment, a sudden commotion broke out. Frank, holding his drink, followed the sound, eventually arriving at an underground boxing arena. Watching the flesh against flesh punches in the ring, hearing the noisy and excited cheers around him, the drunken Frank gradually became agitated. He unleashed all the pent-up frustration in his heart uncontrollably and even provoked the big guy standing next to him. As a result, he was knocked down by his opponent with a lightning-fast punch. But the pain in his cheek did not sober Frank. When Frank continued to provoke, the big guy pinned him down and rained down punches, until Frank was drenched in blood. Looking at himself bruised and swollen in the mirror, Frank suddenly felt a sense of relief. He always felt guilty towards his wife and child, always looking for a way to atone. Now, this seemed like a not-so-bad way. In the following days, Frank buried himself in the boxing arena every day. However, he was no longer a spectator but a fighter in a steel cage. Amidst the jeers and curses of the audience, the drunken Frank was knocked down by one fighter after another. He didn't resist, letting others beat him until he was covered in injuries. Only physical pain could alleviate the guilt in his heart. However, Frank's actions caught the eye of another person. After he was knocked down again, a strong figure suddenly appeared, delivering a thwack that sent his opponent flying, then extended a friendly hand to Frank. That person was Officer Hank. Outside of work, he often came here to box to relieve stress. After all, police work was not as easy as people thought. Frank considered Hank a friend. He took out a photo of his wife and daughter from his wallet and expressed all his regrets. Frank wished he hadn't broken his promise that night, wished he still had a chance to make amends. But now his wife and child were at peace underground, leaving only the utmost pain to accompany him. Seeing Frank in extreme anguish, Hank told him another cruel truth. Because the case had dragged on for too long, coupled with the lack of evidence, the police had decided to cold case it. His case had been reclassified and would be forgotten. These words infuriated Frank. As an expert in manipulating the law, he understood too well what this meant. To put it nicely, it was a cold case. To put it bluntly, it was giving up. Although Hank assured him that he would urge the detectives to investigate, for Frank, those were just meaningless words, having no effect whatsoever. Frank, full of rage, hurried home, but was called back by a prostitute on the street corner. Looking at the girl's innocent face, Frank realized she was about his daughter's age. In that moment, he felt immense pain. He wanted to pull the girl out of the mire, but this caused dissatisfaction to the man. The aggressive man charged forward, punching Frank for interfering in other people's business, and then silently threatened him with a knife. The fire of anger in Frank's heart immediately ignited. Seeing this, the man's subordinates, wielding baseball bats, quickly rushed over. The girl picked up a butterfly knife and plunged it with a thud into Frank's left leg. It seemed some people were not worth saving at all. This scene terrified the girl and the others, sending them scattering in panic. Frank casually picked up a book to cover his wound, limping into the distance. He hid in an alley to avoid police cars, taking off his belt and tying it tightly around his thigh. Finally, the bleeding was temporarily stopped. At this moment, Frank suddenly realized that the book he was holding was Meditation by Marcus Aurelius. A quote within it deeply attracted his attention. In this moment, Frank felt enlightened. He always felt guilty about the death of his wife and child, but he was not the killer. What he needed to do was punish the killer, not harm himself. That very night, Frank was completely captivated by the book. The words within it seemed to possess a magical power, warning him that words were meaningless and actions had weight. This led Frank to decide to discard his strongest weapon. Using silence to face the world once again, Frank had completely found his own path. He filled his garage with exercise equipment, began to train his body, and learned various martial arts. In the time that followed, Frank's body grew stronger and his martial arts became more proficient. At the same time, he also bought many books to cultivate his inner world. Thanks to his strong physique, Frank quickly achieved the feat of defeating his own master. And the meditation book he had also thoroughly studied. He resolved not to utter a single word before avenging his wife and child. Not speaking was to focus on the specific task. To investigate clues, Frank returned to the crime scene alone. The familiar storm drain brought back his painful memories. However, he quickly realized that during his period of silence, his hearing had greatly improved. Frank heard a faint clapping sound from the whistling wind. He followed the sound, climbed the iron tower, and discovered a homeless person's hideout in a container. The food on the table was still very fresh. Clearly, someone was still living there. There were also two simple windows in the container, one of which looked directly onto the crime scene. This discovery made Frank overjoyed. He was convinced that the person living in the container definitely knew something. But just as Frank turned back, he saw several thugs stealing his car. Seeing him appear, the thugs not only didn't run away but arrogantly demanded Frank hand over his car keys and wallet, otherwise they would unleash their dog on him. However, the The dog was frightened by the murderous intent in Frank's eyes. In its heart, it muttered, "If you want to die, don't drag me with you," then turned its tail between its legs and ran away. At this moment, the thugs felt disgraced, but before they could act, Frank made his move. The remaining thugs immediately charged. Frank, of course, was not afraid. He beat the thugs into a cowering heap, screaming miserably. Seeing that these guys were no longer able to resist, Frank took a photo of the leader's face, showed him photos of his wife and child, and used his eyes to interrogate him. However, he quickly noticed the confusion in the leader's eyes, realizing that the opponent knew nothing. Just then, the thug, his face covered in blood, unexpectedly stood up and fired a cold boom at Frank. But he himself also fell to the ground, shot. As if hearing Frank's faint groan, the dog that had run away returned. Its eyes were filled with worry. It shielded Frank, fiercely chasing away the thugs. But Frank's consciousness had begun to blur. In the last moment, before passing out, he vaguely saw a woman driving up. When Frank woke up, he found himself lying on a strange bed. The bullet wound on his body had been bandaged. He quickly got dressed. When the woman entered the room, Frank was hidden behind the door. Noticing the wariness in his eyes, the woman introduced herself as Alma. She was a nurse at a local hospital. She had specifically intervened to save him when she saw he was injured. But Frank showed no gratitude. While Alma's back was turned, he left the house. However, a friend was still waiting for Frank outside. That was the dog he had won over. Seeing that it hadn't abandoned him, a warm feeling welled up in Frank's heart. He proactively took the dog home. In these days, Frank had organized and checked all the clues about the murder of his wife and child. He suddenly realized that on the night of the incident, his wife had rolled down the car window. But at that time, it was clearly raining heavily. This point was clearly illogical. Just as Frank was thinking, the doorbell suddenly rang. Opening the door, it turned out to be Alma. Frank had apparently forgotten his wallet at her house. She had used the address on his driver's license to find him. Seeing her enthusiasm, Frank allowed Alma to change his bandage. However, he still didn't say a word. This made Alma very dissatisfied. Moreover, Alma knew that Frank was not mute, because when he was unconscious, he kept calling his wife and child's names. Hearing these words, Frank took out the funeral invitations of his wife and child. At this point, Alma understood everything. She looked at the clues Frank was organizing, and suddenly remembered that she often walked past the crime scene on her way to and from work. She then told Frank that if he needed help, he could come to her. After bidding Alma farewell, Frank studied the clues while stroking the dog. He suddenly saw the symbol of the Traffic Safety Bureau on its collar. It turned out that this dog was a police dog. Frank was overjoyed. He took out his wife's belongings and led the dog to the crime scene. After sniffing the scent, the dog followed the trail, stood on the manhole cover, and barked incessantly. Frank understood, opened the manhole cover, and indeed found his wife's handbag inside. At this point, suspicion of the homeless person living in the container surged. Frank affirmed that he was either a witness or precisely the culprit he had been looking for all this time. That night, Frank hid in his car, lurking. Before long, he saw a shadowy figure appear stealthily. Seeing this, he got out of the car, intending to approach and question, but the other party was as wary as a rabbit, scattering in panic at the slightest movement. By the time Frank chased him out of the train station, the homeless person had disappeared without a trace. Frank, at a loss, knocked on Alma's door, wanting to ask for information about the homeless person. But Alma was still working at the hospital. However, as soon as she stepped out of the patient's room, she was surrounded by 3 thugs. It seemed the two sides had reached some kind of agreement. Nevertheless, this was a hospital after all, and the thugs dared not do anything major. After a while of threatening, they quickly left. Moments later, Frank had arrived. He took Alma back to the train station. According to Alma, the man living there was called Shivers. He got that nickname because he often coughed incessantly. But Alma had never interacted with Shivers, not even knowing what he looked like. She only knew that Shivers sometimes worked as a chef at a restaurant. After getting the information, Frank took Alma home. But as soon as he left, the 3 thugs stepped out of the shadows. The leader said nothing, charged forward, and grabbed Alma. But the mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind. Frank unexpectedly rushed out from behind the 3 thugs, swiftly knocking them down and disarming them. Seeing his powerful fighting ability, the thugs, who specialized in bullying the weak, were scared out of their wits and timidly turned tail and fled. Facing Frank's questioning gaze, Alma had to explain everything. It turned out that a year ago, she was threatened by thugs and forced to steal forbidden drugs from the hospital. Alma thought it was just that one time, but unexpectedly they became increasingly bold. She couldn't bear it anymore and decided to refuse. As a result, They came directly to threaten her. Seeing Alma in a panic, Frank took her to his home and used his strong arm to comfort her weak heart. Early the next morning, Frank woke up to the rich aroma of food. He saw Alma wearing a white shirt, meticulously busy in the kitchen. This scene left Frank stunned. He couldn't remember how long this cold house had been without the warmth of a family. At the dining table, Alma told Frank that Shivers often coughed incessantly. This helped Frank gradually narrow down his target. Time returned to the present. After subduing Shivers, Frank took out a photo of his wife and child. This time, he clearly saw panic in Shivers' eyes, but no murderous intent. Clearly, Shivers was only a witness, not the killer. And Shivers was so scared that he dared not hide anything, pouring out everything he saw on the night of the incident. He saw that in the storm, a police car stopped Frank's wife and child. A police officer brutally pulled them into the car, murdered them in a warehouse, and then dumped their bodies into the storm drain. The reason Shivers dared not reveal anything was because he was already in constant trouble. How could he dare to offend the police? He only dared to steal Frank's wife's wallet, take all the money inside, and then discard the wallet. This horrifying truth made Frank unable to believe it. He couldn't have imagined that the culprit was a police officer. Leaving the kitchen, Frank went straight to the police station. Taking advantage of the chaos, he sneaked into the police chief's office. Through the computer, he looked up the police officer who had trained at the scene that night, but the result once again astonished him. Because that police officer was Hank, the one who had helped him. Looking at the ultimate perpetrator he had identified, Frank's eyes were mixed with hatred and bewilderment. To avoid wrongly accusing a good person, he secretly went near Hank's house to observe. He saw that after finishing work, Hank changed into different clothes, grabbed a bag, and drove off. Frank followed him all the way, but found that he only went to an underground arena to illegally box. Since Hank had told him about this hobby of his, Frank didn't find anything unusual. In the following days, Frank constantly changed cars, shadowing Hank every day, wanting to find a clue. But Hank's daily life was extremely disciplined. Besides going to work, he only went boxing. Gradually, Frank began to suspect that a man with such a healthy lifestyle could not possibly be a murderer. He noticed that Hank often hid his keys in the flower pot by the door, so he waited for him to go to work and then secretly entered the house. The house was clean and tidy, with a photo of Hank and his daughter hanging on the wall. Everything else seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. However, when Frank searched the closet, he suddenly saw a police uniform with a loose thread. The golden thread glinted in his eyes, and he immediately recalled what the detective had said earlier. At this point, suspicion of Hank reached its peak. Frank almost confirmed he was the culprit. But Frank asked himself, why did he and Hank have no animosity? Why would he harm his wife and child? While pondering, Frank noticed a secret compartment in the closet. He opened it and took out a backpack. Inside were several books written about himself, and beneath them was a newspaper article about the murder. There was a photo of a police officer's daughter, and he remembered Hank's enigmatic smile in previous conversations. At this moment, Frank understood everything. It turned out that a few years ago, Hank's daughter was murdered, but Frank, with his eloquent rhetoric in court, successfully helped the perpetrator escape legal punishment. This caused Hank to harbor resentment. Therefore, his murder of Frank's wife and child was simply to get revenge, to make Frank also experience the pain of losing his dearest loved ones. After reading all this, Frank found a camera in the bag. Inside were all photos of his family. Clearly, Hank had planned this for a long time. In a flash, Frank's anger flared. He had devised a revenge plan. As dusk fell, Hank returned home from work, finding a photo in his car, the very photo Frank had taken from the camera. Behind the photo was Frank's threat. He had obtained evidence of Hank's guilt, threatening him to meet tonight at the warehouse where his wife and child were murdered. Frank had wanted to deal with this enemy himself for a long time. Hank quickly drove to the warehouse. Seeing Frank appear, he pulled out his pistol and got out of the car. The two tormented men finally confronted each other directly. They were both victims, but also perpetrators. At this moment, the rage in Hank's heart almost overflowed. He said nothing, raised his gun, and pulled the trigger. Frank quickly hid behind a nearby barrier. Seeing this, Hank mentioned his daughter and the entire process of Frank's wife and child's deaths. This made Frank unable to bear it any longer. He rolled out, disarming Hank's gun. The two immediately wrestled. Although Frank had honed his martial arts, this time he faced the strong Hank. Hank then jumped up, spun around, and delivered a flying kick. A thud sent Frank flying, disoriented. Seeing this, He raised a wooden plank high and struck Frank hard in the back. At this point, Frank had completely lost the ability to resist, like a punching bag, allowing Hank to torment him. He tried to get up, but Hank gave him no chance. He picked up a piece of metal from the ground and stabbed it forcefully into Frank's side. He locked his opponent's arms into a chokehold, completely subduing Frank. In despair, Frank suddenly found extraordinary strength. He used all his might to pull out the metal piece embedded in his body and used all his strength to stab Hank in the side. In his mind, he had envisioned killing him with his own hands. But the moment he raised the metal piece, he suddenly remembered the words in the book Meditation. The best revenge is to be unlike your enemy. This quote was like a cool breeze in summer, instantly bringing Frank back to his senses. If he plunged the metal piece down, he would become a murderer, just like Hank. Reason in his heart made Frank loosen his tightly clenched left hand, completely ending this cycle of animosity. Everything had settled down. Hank was quickly arrested by the police and received legal punishment. Frank calmly watched all of this on television. His heart remained undisturbed because he had avenged his wife and child in the most righteous way. Frank went to his wife and child's graves, placed fresh flowers, and uttered the first words after his vow of silence. Also the words he considered truly important. I love you. Today's story concludes here. Thank you for watching the film. What do you think of this film? Please comment below.